lifetime building walls, shutting out love, avoiding connection, believing that his empire could fill the emptiness. But in the quiet moments, watching the therapist comfort his grandfather in his final days, something shifted. As his grandfather whispered his last words, the billionaire finally realized no amount of wealth could save him from the aching loneliness in his heart. And the one person who might be able to fill that void was the woman he had dismissed for so long. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to warmly welcome you to the Powder Room Tales, where unforgettable stories are manufactured with you in mind. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single tale from the Powder Room. We'd also love to know, where are you watching us from? Drop your location in the comments below and let's connect as one big family across the world. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. May God bless every one of you, my amazing Powder Room Tales family, with a long, joyful, and fulfilled life. Now, let's get into today's main story. The billionaire was a man of control. From his expansive penthouse perched high above the city to the multi-million-dollar deals that flowed through his hands, Zayne Blackwell had created an empire from nothing. A man known for his precision and ruthlessness, Zayne had built his life around the idea that everything could be controlled: his wealth, his business, his future. But it wasn't just his empire that he meticulously managed, it was his emotions. For years, Zayne had kept himself distant from love, from vulnerability, from anything that might threaten the solitary perfection he had constructed around himself. But at 39, he had everything: status, wealth, power. But still, he stood at the edge of his luxurious world, staring out at the city lights, feeling emptier than ever. His family had raised him to be strong, to lead without distraction, to never give in to weakness. Zayne had learned early on that emotions, love especially, were a burden, a distraction that would only slow him down. But now, standing in his glass-walled office, the phone buzzing with a message from his assistant, Zayne was faced with something he couldn't control: the declining health of his grandfather, Miles Blackwell. The old man had been the only consistent person in Zayne's life, yet he'd been neglected in the whirlwind of corporate meetings and global acquisitions. The news of Miles's health only underscored how disconnected Zayne had become from the people who truly mattered. The message was simple: your grandfather's condition has worsened. We recommend hospice care. It felt like a punch in the gut. For a man who had built his empire through hard work, control, and ambition, the reality of Miles's mortality was something that couldn't be managed or fixed. Zayne was left with the realization that for all his wealth and power, he couldn't control the course of human life, especially the lives of his loved ones.
At the same time, across town, Kamaria, or Cam Carter, was preparing for another day in her role as a therapist. Kamaria had always been the kind of woman who cared deeply for others, someone who could see the pain behind a smile and the struggle behind a professional mask. A 32-year-old therapist specializing in palliative care, she had dedicated herself to helping people confront the end of their lives, making their final days more meaningful and peaceful. It was a job that demanded empathy and patience, qualities that Kamaria had in abundance. Her small apartment, cozy and filled with books and personal mementos, was a stark contrast to the luxury that surrounded Zayne. She didn't need the trappings of wealth to feel fulfilled. Her life was full, meaningful, not in the material sense, but in the emotional connections she nurtured. She was passionate about her work, but it had come at a cost. She had often kept herself at a distance emotionally, wary of letting anyone in too close. Her past experiences with love had taught her to be cautious, to hold back. But the work she did brought her into intimate contact with the human experience, grief, loss, and the search for meaning in the final days, and it required a vulnerability she wasn't always comfortable with. Her latest assignment, Miles Blackwell, the billionaire's grandfather. Kamaria was tasked with helping him through the final stages of his life. His family, as usual, was distant, but Kamaria had seen it all before. Wealthy families often hired her to care for their elderly relatives, but they rarely participate in the care themselves. It was another reminder that people like Zayne Blackwell often saw emotional connection as a weakness, an inconvenience that stood in the way of their success. But something about Miles intrigued Kamaria. The quiet dignity in his eyes, the way he seemed to hold on to memories like treasures. There was a deep humanity in him that reached out to her, even though he couldn't express it in words. She hadn't met Zayne yet, but she could already tell that the man who had built such a vast empire was the opposite of his grandfather, emotionally closed off, distant, perhaps even colder than the sleek, polished surroundings he had created. The first time Kamaria entered Miles's private room, she was struck by the contrast. The sterile bedhead, the monitors, the quiet hum of machines, they felt out of place in the comfortable, dimly lit room, filled with family photos and the faint scent of old books. She knew Miles's days were numbered, but there was still something she could offer him, something more than just medical care. She could offer him peace, dignity, and the space to confront his feelings before the end. "Hello, Mr. Blackwell," she said gently as she walked in, her voice soothing and calm. Miles looked up at her, his eyes sharp despite his frailty. "You're the new one, aren't you?" he asked, his voice raspy but clear.
"Yes, I am," Kamaria replied with a smile. "But I'm here to make sure you're as comfortable as possible in these final days. We'll make sure you're not alone in this." He smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening for a brief moment. There was something deeply human about him, something she hadn't expected from a man of his stature, his wealth. Kamaria wasn't here for the Blackwell name. She was here to help the person beneath it. As they spoke, Kamaria listened to Miles recount memories of his younger years, his family, and the deep regrets he harbored. It was clear that he had lived a life of ambition, but now, as he faced his own mortality, he longed for the connections he had lost along the way. And in the midst of this, the phone buzzed in Zayne Blackwell's office again. This time it was a call from his assistant, reminding him that he was scheduled to visit his grandfather. He had been avoiding it for days, pushing it off with excuses about meetings, deadlines, and travel. But now he had no choice. His grandfather was fading fast, and this might be his last chance to make things right. Do you think that wealth and success can fill the emptiness of loneliness, or is there something more meaningful that we all need? Zayne and Kamaria are worlds apart, but their paths are about to cross. What do you think happens when two people from completely different worlds collide? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The moment Zayne Blackwell stepped into his grandfather's room, everything changed. He had walked through the halls of his mansion, through the corridors of power and success, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of this moment. The sterile smell of the hospital, the quiet hum of machines. It all felt like a distant echo compared to the warmth of the memories that clung to his grandfather's room. Miles Blackwell, a man who had spent decades building an empire, who had ruled with an iron fist, was lying in front of him, frail and vulnerable. It was a side of his grandfather that Zayne had never truly seen. As he walked in, the familiar sharp contours of his grandfather's face softened with a gentle smile. His once commanding presence had been replaced by the quiet dignity of a man nearing the end of his life. "Grandfather," Zayne said, his voice low, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Miles gave a weak chuckle, his old eyes twinkling with a flicker of recognition. Still too busy to come visit me, huh, Zayne? You only show up when I'm about to die." Zayne swallowed, his throat tightening. The words stung more than he expected, not because they were untrue, but because they reflected everything he had been avoiding. Miles had always been the one who tried to reach him, trying to get him to understand that life wasn't just about success. And now, in these final days, he was still trying to teach him. "I've been busy," Zayne replied, his voice betraying his discomfort. "The company, it's been a lot to manage." Miles chuckled softly, the sound of it a frail whisper. "Always about the company, always about your empire. But you've forgotten something along the way, my boy. You've forgotten about the people that matter. People like me, and people like her." His eyes flickered toward the door, where Kamaria Carter, the therapist, stood quietly, waiting patiently. Zayne's gaze shifted to her. She was standing at the edge of the room, her presence a stark contrast to the sterile, cold environment of the hospice. Kamaria was a woman who seemed entirely out of place in this world of wealth and power. She was dressed simply. Her black blouse and plans were professional, yet her demeanor was warm and approachable. Her gentle smile and compassionate eyes immediately caught his attention, though he quickly dismissed them. This was a hospice. She was just doing her job. But Miles had been right. There was something about her that caught his attention, something that lingered in his chest long after she spoke. Kamaria met his gaze, offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement before turning her attention back to Miles. "How are we feeling today, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked, her voice smooth and calming like the softest of lullabies. Zayne watched her, noticing the way Miles responded to her. There was a shift in Miles's eyes when he looked at her, something unspoken but powerful. It was the way a person reacted when they were finally able to find comfort after a long, hard journey. Kamaria had a way of making people feel seen, heard, and cared for, and Zayne couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of that kindness, that warmth. "Better than I've felt in weeks, my dear," Miles replied, his voice laced with affection. "This young lady knows how to make an old man feel better, Zayne. She's the one who's been easing my pain. Not the doctors, not the machines. She's been doing more for me than you ever did." The words stung, but Zayne held his ground. He had always been the one to provide. He had always been the one who thought he could fix everything. But here, standing in front of his dying grandfather, he realized that the things that mattered most, love, connection, understanding, were the very things he had neglected. And it hurt. It hurt more than he was willing to admit. "I'm just doing my job," Kamaria said softly, her eyes briefly meeting Zayne's. Her voice held no pretension, no grand claims. There was something quietly powerful in her humility, in the way she made it clear that her purpose wasn't about her. It was about her patients. "I think your grandfather is very lucky to have someone like you looking after him," Zayne said, his voice steady, but betraying a hint of something else. Admiration? He wasn't sure. Kamaria met his gaze, offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement before turning her attention back to Miles. "It's my honor, Mr. Blackwell, but it's not about luck. It's about being present. That's something we all could use more of."
For a brief moment, Zayne felt a flicker of something inside him. Something soft, something vulnerable. The way she spoke to his grandfather, the ease with which she made him feel heard, it was a stark contrast to the cold, transactional relationships he had always cultivated. Kamaria had a gift, a gift he had never really understood until now. Miles, watching the two of them exchange words, let out a deep sigh.
The way you two look at each other. Don't act like you don't feel it, Zayne. I've seen this before. People running from connection, thinking they're too busy, too important. But one day you'll look back and realize that no amount of wealth, no amount of success will matter without someone to share it with.
Zayne felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He didn't want to admit it, but Miles was right. He had spent so many years focusing on the wrong things, building his empire and pushing people away, including his own family. But here, in the presence of a simple therapist, he was finally beginning to understand what his grandfather had been trying to tell him all along. Kamaria had given his grandfather peace in his final days, something Zayne had never been able to provide. As the visit drew to a close, Zayne stood up to leave, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't articulate. He turned to Kamaria, his voice hesitant. "Thank you for everything you've done for him." Kamaria nodded, her gaze soft. "It's my privilege. I just do what I can." For a moment, their eyes met, and Zayne felt something shift within him, something deeper than gratitude, something that made him want to stay, to ask more, to open up in a way he never had before. But before he could say anything else, Miles spoke, his voice raspy but filled with certainty. "Go ahead, Zayne. Don't be afraid to live. Don't be afraid to love." The words settled in Zayne's chest, echoing long after he left the room. Kamaria had made a difference in his grandfather's final days, but the question lingered. Could she make a difference in his life, too? Have you ever felt the weight of missed opportunities, of things you didn't realize you were missing until it was almost too late? Zayne is facing a moment of truth. Will he continue to live his life focused solely on business? Or will he take a chance on love and connection? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. After the visit to his grandfather's room, Zayne Blackwell tried to push the emotions swirling inside him to the back of his mind. He was a man who had built his world on control, precision, and detachment. The idea of feeling, of being vulnerable, was not just foreign to him. It was something he had spent a lifetime avoiding. His grandfather's words, however, lingered. "Don't be afraid to live. Don't be afraid to love." They echoed in his mind, becoming a constant whisper in the background of his thoughts. But each time he tried to listen to that whisper, to understand its meaning, he found himself retreating, locking those emotions behind the steel doors he had built around his heart. It was a defense mechanism, something he had perfected over the years. He had been hurt before, deeply. Losing his first love in a tragic accident had left a scar that he had buried under layers of wealth and achievement. He hadn't allowed himself to feel since. Feeling was dangerous. It opened the door to hurt, to vulnerability, and Zayne wasn't willing to face that again, not even now, not with Kamaria. Kamaria had noticed the shift in Zayne the moment he had left the room that day. She hadn't expected him to be so open, to let his guard down for even the briefest of moments. But the mask he had worn so carefully had cracked, if only slightly, and for a fleeting second she saw a different side of him, the side that longed for something more, something beyond his empire. But the distance came back quickly. She was used to being the one who helped people. She'd always been the emotional pillar, the one who gave. But when it came to Zayne, something inside her began to shift. She found herself wanting to help him in ways she hadn't anticipated. His coldness, his detached demeanor made it clear that he wasn't ready for any kind of emotional connection. And yet, every time their paths crossed, there was a tension between them, something she couldn't quite ignore. She had kept her professional boundaries intact, but Zayne was different. She didn't know if it was the way he had reacted to his grandfather's condition or the fact that he had opened up, just a little. But she felt a pull toward him. It wasn't just the attraction, it was the challenge. She wanted to be the one to break through the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself. But that desire conflicted with her professionalism. She couldn't allow herself to cross that line. The next time they met was at the hospice facility. Zayne had agreed to visit his grandfather again, but this time he didn't come alone. The board of directors had scheduled a meeting at the same time, and he needed to juggle both. As he walked into the room, his eyes flicked over to Kamaria, who was sitting by Miles Blackwell's bed, her face serene and calm as she spoke with the old man.
For a brief moment, Zayne hesitated in the doorway. There was something comforting about the way Kamaria interacted with his grandfather, something that felt like a lifeline in the coldness of this situation. But then the door clicked behind him, and he remembered who he was. Zayne Blackwell, the man who had built everything from nothing, the man who didn't need anyone. He straightened his back and walked into the room, trying to ignore the warmth he felt at the sight of her. But Kamaria noticed the change in him instantly. The walls were back up. He was no longer the man who had shared a quiet moment of vulnerability with her. He was the billionaire, the businessman, the man who didn't let anyone in. "I see you've come for another visit," Kamaria said, her tone neutral, though there was an underlying warmth in her voice that made Zayne pause. "Yes," he replied curtly, taking a seat near the window. "I just had a meeting. I thought I'd stop by and check on things." Miles, who had been quietly observing their exchange, let out a soft laugh. "Ha! You're a hard man to crack, Zayne. I can see why you've been so successful. But you don't have to be so guarded all the time. Life isn't about the deals you make. It's about the people who were there when you need them the most." The word stung, though Zayne didn't let it show. Kamaria turned to look at him, her expression soft, almost knowing. And for a brief moment, Zayne felt exposed. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to face the truth that his grandfather was right, but he couldn't escape it. Instead of replying, he simply stood and walked over to the window, his back to them both. "I need to go," he said after a long pause, his voice tight. "I've got more work to handle." Before Kamaria could say anything, Zayne turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. He didn't know why he left so abruptly. Maybe it was the reminder that his grandfather's time was running out. Maybe it was the unspoken connection he felt with Kamaria that he wasn't ready to deal with. But whatever it was easier to run than to face it. Have you ever resisted emotional vulnerability only to realize it was the very thing you needed most? Zayne is running from something deeper than just his grandfather's decline. Do you think he will continue to close off his heart? Or will Kamaria be the one to help him confront his fears? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
The next few days felt like a blur. Zayne Blackwell had returned to his routine, focusing on business, keeping his emotional walls firmly in place. The days with Kamaria seemed distant, like a dream he couldn't quite hold on to, but no matter how hard he tried to push it all away, the memory of her words, of her touch, lingered. It was like something had shifted inside him, something he couldn't explain, couldn't control. It was on the 5th day after his abrupt departure that his assistant called to inform him that his grandfather had taken a turn for the worse. The doctors had recommended he return to the hospice immediately, as Miles Blackwell's condition had become critical. His heart clenched in his chest at the thought of his grandfather slipping away. There was no time to waste. This time, as he entered Miles's room, he was unprepared for the reality of what he found. Miles was pale, his breathing shallow. The once proud man who had built an empire was now lying in a hospital bed, frail and vulnerable. But there was still a flicker of life in his eyes as he looked up at Zayne. "You came back," Miles rasped. A faint smile curled at the corners of his lips. "I'm here," Zayne replied, his voice thick with emotion. He walked to the side of the bed, not knowing what to say, but feeling the weight of his presence in that moment. His grandfather had always been a guiding force in his life, a mentor, a protector. Now, seeing him like this, it was as if everything Zayne had built, the empire, the wealth, the success, was meaningless in the face of his grandfather's mortality.
Kamaria was already there, sitting in a chair by the window, her presence calm and unobtrusive. Zayne had almost forgotten she would be here, that she had been part of his grandfather's care throughout the past few weeks. She had seen the man in his most vulnerable moments, witnessed his pain, his regrets, and his attempts at redemption. She looked up when he entered, her expression unreadable, though her eyes softened when they met his. She stood to give him space, but Zayne stopped her with a glance. He couldn't bring himself to say anything, but his gaze lingered on her, on the way she had been there for his grandfather, offering comfort and solace when it was most needed. "I've been doing my best to make him comfortable," Kamaria said, her voice low as she approached the bed. "His pain is under control. We're just trying to make sure his final moments are peaceful." Zayne nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." The words felt insufficient. Kamaria had done more for Miles in his last days than Zayne had done in the past decade. It was as if she could connect with people in a way he couldn't, a gift that he both admired and resented. He had spent his life focusing on building a legacy, on making a name for himself. But in the end, it was Kamaria who had brought peace to his family. And in some strange, unexpected way, Zayne couldn't help but feel drawn to her.
"Would you mind stepping outside for a moment, Zayne?" Kamaria asked, her voice gentle, as she checked the monitors and adjusted the blankets around Miles. "I need to speak with him privately." He hesitated. There was a tightness in his chest, as if something inside him didn't want to leave, didn't want to face the reality of his grandfather's passing. But after a long moment, he nodded and walked to the door. Once outside, he leaned against the cool wall, his hands in his pockets. His mind was racing. It was too much. The thought of losing Miles, the only constant in his life, was almost too overwhelming to bear. He had never been close to many people, but his grandfather had always been there, a silent anchor in his world. Now, Zayne felt completely unmoored. But before he could spiral too deeply into his thoughts, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and found Kamaria standing in the hallway, her expression soft yet determined. "You don't have to go through this alone," she said, her eyes steady and kind. "I know that you've been shutting yourself off, but this is real, and you need to be present for him, for yourself." Zayne felt a knot form in his throat. He had always been so used to controlling everything, his company, his future, his emotions. But now, standing before Kamaria, he couldn't deny that he had been running from the emotions that scared him the most, from the vulnerability that he had been trying to suppress his entire life. "I don't know how to be present," he confessed, his voice raw. "I don't know how to let go." Kamaria took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "It's not about letting go, Zayne. It's about being real, being human. Your grandfather is showing you that. He's showing you what it means to face the end with dignity, to face life, every part of it, with honesty." The words struck Zayne deeply. Kamaria was right. He had spent so long building a life that was centered around his empire, around his success, that he had forgotten what it meant to be human. And now, with his grandfather's health deteriorating, he was being forced to face the reality that no amount of money could replace the one thing he had long avoided: connection. "I don't know if I'm ready," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But I don't want to lose him without at least trying." Kamaria smiled softly, the warmth in her eyes undeniable. "It's never too late to try. Have you ever struggled with letting down your walls and allowing yourself to feel vulnerable? What made you take that first step? Zayne is facing the hardest choice of his life,
Will he open up to Kamaria and confront the vulnerability he spent his life avoiding? Or will he continue to retreat into the cold distance he's known? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The following days passed in a haze. Zayne Blackwell felt as if he were watching everything unfold through a fogged window, his emotions distant, his thoughts scattered. Miles Blackwell was slipping away, his breathing becoming more shallow, his once strong presence fading with each passing hour. Despite the financial wealth and influence Zayne had amassed, none of it seemed to matter now. His grandfather, the man who had shaped his life in ways that Zayne had never fully acknowledged, was nearing the end. And as he watched Kamaria care for him, offering comfort and compassion with a tenderness he had never seen from anyone else, something inside him began to crack open. It was during one of those long, quiet evenings in the hospice room that the truth of his own heart began to emerge. Kamaria was there, as she had been every evening, her presence calming, a quiet beacon of light amid the inevitable darkness. She sat next to Miles, holding his hand, speaking to him softly, ensuring that his final days were as comfortable as possible. Zayne had tried to keep his distance at first, burying himself in business calls, pretending that the reality of his grandfather's passing hadn't begun to affect him. But it was impossible to ignore the way Kamaria had become his anchor in this moment. "Zayne," Kamaria said one evening as they sat quietly in the room. Miles had fallen asleep, the soft rhythm of his breath steady for now. "Can we talk?" He looked at her, the uncertainty in her voice pulling him away from the thoughts that had been racing in his mind. There was something raw in the way she looked at him now. Not the professional distance she had maintained before, but something more personal. He saw it in her eyes. The understanding that he was unraveling, that the walls he had so carefully built were starting to falter. He acknowledged with a tight knot in his side. "Of course." He took a breath as though choosing his words carefully. "I can see that you're struggling," she began, her voice soft yet steady. "I can see that you've spent so much of your life pushing emotions away, trying to control everything. But what I've learned in my own work is that the things we try to avoid, our grief, our pain, our fear, they don't go away. They just stay with us. They become part of us." Zayne stiffened at her words. There was no accusation in her tone, only an unspoken truth that hit too close to home. He had always controlled his emotions, kept them at bay, telling himself that work, success, wealth, these are the things that mattered. But now, with Miles slipping away and Kamaria in front of him, he realized that all those years of detachment hadn't protected him. They had only kept him from experiencing life fully.
"I don't know how to stop running," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. His usual confidence, his control, had vanished. In its place was a raw vulnerability he wasn't used to showing anyone. Kamaria looked at him with quiet understanding. "You don't have to do it alone, Zayne. No one expects you to have all the answers, and you don't have to keep carrying everything by yourself. I've seen it in my work with families. Holding on to the past, trying to maintain control, keeps us from healing. But it's never too late to begin." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Zayne felt something shift inside him, something that he had tried so hard to suppress. He was a man who had spent most of his life pushing people away, burying himself in work, and avoiding emotional connections. But now, here with Kamaria, the walls that had defined him for so long felt fragile, ready to collapse. "I don't know how much about me," Zayne said after a moment, his voice rough. "I wasn't always like this. I didn't always hide behind my work.
Kamaria turned toward him, her eyes softening with curiosity. "Tell me," she said quietly, her voice filled with gentleness. "You don't have to, but I'm here." Zayne hesitated, his thoughts swirling, but there, in the quiet of the room, with the weight of his grandfather's impending death hanging in the air, he realized he couldn't hold back anymore. The story of his life, the one he had carefully crafted to protect himself from hurt, was ready to be shared. "I was in love once," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Her name was Isabel. We met when I was in my early 20s, before I became the man I am now. She was different. She made me feel alive, like the world wasn't just about what I could control, what I could conquer. I loved her, but she didn't love me in the way I needed. She wanted more. She wanted a life with someone emotionally available, someone who could show up for her, but I couldn't. I couldn't open up to her the way she needed me to, and when I lost her, I promised myself that I'd never let anyone in again." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken understanding. Kamaria had heard similar stories in her work, but hearing Zayne's story, the man she had seen as cold and distant, made her realize just how much he had suffered. "I shut myself off from the world after that," Zayne continued, his voice quieter now. "I threw myself into building my company, becoming the man I thought I needed to be, but I lost so much along the way. I've spent years building this empire, but it's built on walls I've put up to protect myself from being hurt. And now here I am, and I don't know how to let anyone in."
There it was again, the words she had spoken so many times in her work with others. She had always known that people needed permission to feel, to grieve, to be vulnerable. But hearing Zayne's words, seeing the rawness of his pain, made her realize how deeply he had buried his feelings. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said gently, her voice filled with compassion. "We all need help sometimes. You don't have to be the strong, unbreakable man all the time." Zayne met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't look away. The walls that had separated him from the world, from her, felt like they were crumbling, bit by bit. Have you ever buried a part of yourself to protect it from pain? What would it take for you to allow yourself to feel again? Zayne is facing the hardest truth of his life. Will he be able to confront the emotional wounds he's hidden for so long? Share your thoughts on how vulnerability can lead to healing in the comments below. The next few days passed with a new delicate rhythm. Zayne Blackwell had arrived at a turning point, and with each passing moment, he felt a little more at peace, willing to let go of the emotional armor he had spent his entire life constructing. It was a strange sensation, the kind that made him feel as though he were stepping into unknown territory. Vulnerability, something he had long rejected, was now becoming something he was willing to explore. Kamaria, on the other hand, had always been in touch with vulnerability. She had made a career out of helping people confront the end of their lives, to accept the inevitable and find peace before they departed. She had always believed in the power of emotional connection, in the deep healing that came from truly understanding and supporting another person. Yet despite her ability to give so much of herself to others, there was something about Zayne that stirred a part of her she hadn't expected. He was a man who had spent years hiding behind his wealth, behind his power, and watching him slowly dismantle those defenses, willingly, vulnerably, was a process that left her emotionally raw. The connection between them was undeniable. Their shared moments, their small conversations, the way Zayne opened up just a little more each time, they all formed a foundation of trust. What had started as professional courtesy, with Kamaria caring for Miles Blackwell and Zayne reluctantly showing up to ensure his grandfather's comfort, had slowly turned into something more. They spent their time together when Zayne wasn't buried in meetings, strolling through the hospice grounds, taking walks along the quiet corridors, or sitting in the lobby sipping coffee. And each time there was something more between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. One afternoon, as the late sunlight filtered through the windows of the hospice, casting long shadows along the floor, Kamaria was sitting in one of the rooms near the garden, reading through some notes. Zayne walked in, quietly, as if he had something on his mind but wasn't sure how to say it.
There it was again, the words she had spoken so many times in her work with others. She had always known that people needed permission to feel, to grieve, to be vulnerable. But hearing Zayne's words, seeing the rawness of his pain, made her realize how deeply he had buried his feelings. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she said gently, her voice filled with compassion. "We all need help sometimes. You don't have to be the strong, unbreakable man all the time." Zayne met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't look away. The walls that had separated him from the world, from her, felt like they were crumbling, bit by bit. Have you ever buried a part of yourself to protect it from pain? What would it take for you to allow yourself to feel again? Zayne is facing the hardest truth of his life. Will he be able to confront the emotional wounds he's hidden for so long? Share your thoughts on how vulnerability can lead to healing in the comments below. The next few days passed with a new delicate rhythm. Zayne Blackwell had arrived at a turning point, and with each passing moment, he felt a little more at peace, willing to let go of the emotional armor he had spent his entire life constructing. It was a strange sensation, the kind that made him feel as though he were stepping into unknown territory. Vulnerability, something he had long rejected, was now becoming something he was willing to explore. Kamaria, on the other hand, had always been in touch with vulnerability. She had made a career out of helping people confront the end of their lives, to accept the inevitable and find peace before they departed. She had always believed in the power of emotional connection, in the deep healing that came from truly understanding and supporting another person. Yet despite her ability to give so much of herself to others, there was something about Zayne that stirred a part of her she hadn't expected. He was a man who had spent years hiding behind his wealth, behind his power, and watching him slowly dismantle those defenses, willingly, vulnerably, was a process that left her emotionally raw. The connection between them was undeniable. Their shared moments, their small conversations, the way Zayne opened up just a little more each time, they all formed a foundation of trust. What had started as professional courtesy, with Kamaria caring for Miles Blackwell and Zayne reluctantly showing up to ensure his grandfather's comfort, had slowly turned into something more. They spent their time together when Zayne wasn't buried in meetings, strolling through the hospice grounds, taking walks along the quiet corridors, or sitting in the lobby sipping coffee. And each time there was something more between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. One afternoon, as the late sunlight filtered through the windows of the hospice, casting long shadows along the floor, Kamaria was sitting in one of the rooms near the garden, reading through some notes. Zayne walked in, quietly, as if he had something on his mind but wasn't sure how to say it. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice more tentative than usual. "About what you said, about not running anymore." She set her notes aside and looked up at him. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, and it made her heart tighten. Zayne, the man who had built an empire, who had carried the weight of his family's legacy, was now standing before her like a man unsure of himself, unsure of how to proceed. "You don't have to carry it all alone, Zayne," she said softly, her tone comforting yet firm. "You've been running from something, your grief, your past, your fears, but now you're starting to face them, and that takes courage." He nodded, a slight crease between his brows, as though he were contemplating her words. He took a seat across from her, closer than he ever had before. It wasn't that the distance between them was physical, it had always been emotional, but now there was something different in the air, something palpable. "I've spent my whole life thinking that if I just kept moving forward, if I just kept building, working, succeeding, that I could outrun the pain, that I could outrun everything I've lost," Zayne confessed, his voice rough. "I thought if I became successful enough, powerful enough, I wouldn't have to feel. But every time I look at you, Cam, I realize that's not true. I don't want to run anymore. I want to face it, whatever it is. And maybe I need you to help me." Kamaria's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say that, at least not so openly. The truth of his words was raw, cutting through the professional mask he had worn for so long. And the realization that Zayne was asking for help, her help, felt like a turning point. Not just for him, but for her as well. She had spent so much of her life guiding others, helping them find peace. But now she was being asked to help someone open up, to face their darkest fears. And the weight of that responsibility was not lost on her. "You're already on your way, Zayne," she said gently, her voice filled with understanding. "It's not easy, and it won't be a quick fix, but you're beginning to see that there's more to life than just success. There's love, there's connection, there's understanding, and that's where healing starts." Zayne looked at her, his gaze intense, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken words, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that held promise, a silence that meant something had shifted between them. "You make it sound so simple," Zayne said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Kamaria smiled back, her eyes warm. "It can be simple once you allow yourself to see it. The hardest part is accepting that it's okay to feel, to be vulnerable. We're all human, Zayne, and the best parts of life come when we let ourselves connect with others."
He looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing her not just as the therapist who had been working with his grandfather, but as a woman who had become someone important in his life. Someone who had opened him up in ways he hadn't known were possible. Her words had made him feel things he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what those feelings might lead to. "I'm ready," Zayne said, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to keep hiding. I don't want to be alone anymore. I don't want to keep pretending that success is all I need." Kamaria leaned forward slightly, meeting his gaze with an open, empathetic smile. "You don't have to be alone, Zayne. You don't have to face this by yourself." There it was again, the unspoken connection between them, a bond that had been forming, quietly, over the course of their time together. Kamaria had never expected this, never thought she would find herself here with him, this man who had built an empire, who had built walls around himself to protect his heart. But now, here she was, finding a different side of him, one that he was finally ready to share. And as the soft light from the window bathed them in their golden glow, Zayne reached out, tentatively at first, but then with more certainty, and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. a gesture that bridged the emotional distance between them, a gesture that said they were both ready for something new. They sat in silence for a moment, the world outside the room fading into the background as they shared a quiet connection. For the first time, Zayne felt like he was no longer alone in his journey. Have you ever been afraid to face your vulnerability, to let someone else in? What was it that helped you take that first step? Zayne and Kamaria are finding new paths in their relationship, but the journey isn't over yet. Do you think they can truly face their pasts together? Let me know what you think in the comments below. The days that followed felt like a delicate balance. Zayne Blackwell was trying to navigate the newfound vulnerability he had let slip through the cracks of his carefully built walls. He was no longer the man who viewed life through the lens of control and success alone. He was someone who had allowed himself to feel again, to open up to the idea of love and connection. But as much as he wanted to embrace this shift, the reality of his past and the world he had built had a way of pulling him back. It was late one evening when everything started to unravel. The hospice room was quieter than usual. Miles Blackwell had slipped into a light sleep, his breathing steady but faint. Kamaria was sitting by his side, as she had every night for the past few weeks, offering him comfort in his final days. Zayne had been there earlier, but now, as night descended, he was on a conference call, his mind still occupied by the endless demands of his empire.
His phone buzzed, and a message flashed across the screen. It was from his assistant. "A major issue has come up with one of your biggest deals. We need your decision right away." Zayne's mind immediately shifted. The weight of his responsibilities settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had been balancing his role as a grandson and as a businessman, but the latter always seemed to demand his attention. He had grown accustomed to juggling his family's needs with the endless expectations of his company, and now, with Miles nearing the end, it felt even more urgent to secure his legacy. He excused himself from the room, quietly closing the door behind him, trying to give Kamaria some space with Miles. But the moment he stepped into the hallway, the weight of the situation hit him. There was no avoiding it. He had to make a choice. The decision regarding the deal was critical to his business, but if he didn't act now, it could cost him millions. The temptation to retreat to his office and handle the matter was overwhelming. After all, his empire had always come first, and that had been his guiding principle for so long. Yet something in his gut told him that this was different. Kamaria had told him to be present, to face the pain of the past. But could he do that without losing himself? Could he abandon the world he had built in favor of what truly mattered? His phone buzzed again, breaking through his thoughts. He knew he couldn't afford to ignore it. Kamaria, sensing his conflict, appeared in the hallway. Her presence was gentle, a calming force amidst the storm of Zayne's thoughts. She had seen this struggle before, people torn between the things they could control and the things they couldn't. She could tell by the tightness in his jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, that he was fighting himself. "Zayne," she said, her voice soft yet firm, "don't do this." He looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "You're running again. You're running from the one thing that matters right now. This moment," Kamaria said, her words steady but heavy with meaning. "You can't keep trying to fix everything with your business, with your work. Your grandfather is here, and I'm here, and the world will keep turning whether you make this deal or not. But the time you have left with your grandfather, the time you have left to make things right, that's the only thing you can't control." For a moment, Zayne didn't know how to respond. He wanted to argue, to justify the importance of his company, of his legacy. But in the silence of the hallway, surrounded by the reality of Miles's fragility, he realized Kamaria was right. He had been running from something deeper than just his work. He had been running from the very thing that made him human,
his ability to feel.
"I don't know how to balance it all, Kamaria," he admitted, his voice rough. "I've spent so long focusing on the business, on what I can control, that I don't know how to just be." Her expression softened, and she took a step closer. "You don't have to do it all alone, Zayne. You don't have to face everything by yourself." The tenderness in her voice, in her eyes, shook him. He had spent so long believing that his worth was tied to his business achievements, that success was the only thing that mattered. But now, standing before her, he felt the pull of something different, something real. Before he could respond, the door to Miles' room opened behind him. Kamaria turned, her expression unreadable. Zayne followed her gaze, and his heart dropped as he saw Miles, his grandfather's frail body, lying motionless in the bed. He rushed toward him, his pulse quickening, but as he reached his grandfather's side, he realized with a sinking heart that it was too late. Miles had passed away quietly in his sleep. Kamaria placed a hand on his shoulder, her presence a grounding force in the storm of emotions that suddenly overtook him. But Zayne couldn't bring himself to look at her. He couldn't bring himself to look at anyone. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly lost. When faced with a choice between work and personal connection, what would you choose? Do you ever feel like you're losing sight of what truly matters? Zayne is at a crossroads, torn between his career and his emotions. Will he learn to embrace vulnerability and face his grief? Or will he continue down the path of emotional detachment? Let me know what you think in the comments below. The night after Miles Blackwell passed away, Zayne couldn't sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, a cacophony of memories, regrets, and most of all, questions. The loss of his grandfather hit him like a physical blow, yet he didn't have the luxury of grieving. The world didn't stop for death. It kept spinning, relentless, demanding his attention. And yet, as he sat in his office, staring at the city lights below, a deep sense of emptiness gnawed at him. For the first time in his life, Zayne found himself questioning everything he had built, everything he had strived for. His wealth, his empire, his cold, calculating success, all of it seemed insignificant in the face of the real truth he had been avoiding. His heart was still empty. His connection to his grandfather, the man who had shaped him, was gone, and he had allowed it to happen. The reality of Miles's passing brought something else to the surface, a raw vulnerability that Zayne had spent years burying. He had ignored his emotions, thinking he could outrun them. But now, with Miles gone, with Kamaria still in his mind, there was no escape.
He stood abruptly, pacing the room, the weight of the past few days settling heavily on his shoulders. The decision he had been avoiding, the choice between his business and his heart, was no longer something he could put off. There was a knock on the door. "Zayne?" It was Kamaria. Her voice was soft, but there was no mistaking the concern in it. "Can we talk?" He turned toward the door, his heart racing. The vulnerability in her presence both terrified and comforted him. She had been there for him, for his family, in ways that no one else had been. And despite all his resistance, despite all the emotional walls he had erected around himself, he knew one thing for certain. Kamaria was not like the others. She was not a distraction or a business deal. She was real. He opened the door. Kamaria stood there, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked at him as if waiting for him to invite her in. And for the first time in a long time, Zayne found himself not wanting to hide from her. He wasn't ready to say the words, wasn't sure he even knew what to say, but he knew that he had to let her in. "Come in." he said quietly, stepping aside. As she walked into the room, the tension between them was palpable. Zayne had never been one to show weakness, but tonight, in the quiet of his office, he felt it. His heart lay bare, stripped of its usual armor. They sat down together in the soft light of the office, the city lights outside casting a muted glow on everything. Kamaria didn't speak at first, letting the silence linger. Zayne fidgeted with his cufflinks, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know what to do," he said, his voice strained. The words felt foreign coming from him, like he had forgotten how to be vulnerable, how to share what he was truly feeling. But for once, he didn't try to hide it. He didn't pretend. "I've spent my whole life building walls around myself, walls to protect me from feeling, from caring. And now, with everything that's happened, I don't know how to let go of that." Kamaria watched him, her expression softening. "You don't have to let go all at once, Zayne. It's not about giving up control. It's about choosing to be present, choosing to feel even when it's hard." Zayne looked at her then, really looked at her. There was something so different about the way she spoke, something real, something grounded in truth. He had spent so much of his life avoiding people like her, people who could break through his defenses, who could make him confront the parts of himself he didn't want to see. But now, as he sat across from her, he realized that he didn't want to avoid her anymore. He didn't want to keep running. "I don't know how to choose this," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of his emotions. "I don't know how to choose us, Kamaria. My world has always been about control, about doing what I can to protect myself, to protect my company, my legacy. But what if I fail? What if I let go and everything falls apart?" Kamaria leaned forward, her gaze steady and unwavering. "What if it doesn't? What if letting go is the thing that will make you whole again? You don't have to be perfect, Zayne. You just have to show up. You just have to be here, with me, with yourself." His chest tightened as he listened to her words. He had spent so much of his life running from what he was afraid of, his feelings, his grief, his desire for connection. But now, in the quiet of his office, with Kamaria sitting across from him, he realized that he didn't have to run anymore. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice gaining strength. "I've been afraid for too long. Afraid of feeling, afraid of caring, but I don't want to be afraid anymore. I don't want to lose what's important, not this time." Kamaria smiled softly, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "Then you're already making the choice, Zayne. You're already choosing to step forward, and that's the hardest part." For a moment, the room was silent, save for the quiet hum of the city below. Zayne looked at Kamaria, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been running from so many things, his feelings, his grief, his desire for connection. But now, in the quiet of his office, with Kamaria sitting across from him, he realized that he didn't have to run anymore. "I don't have all the answers, but I want to try. With you. I'm ready to face it. All of it." Kamaria's eyes softened, and she reached out, gently taking his hand in hers. "And I'll be right here, Zayne, every step of the way." Have you ever felt like you were too afraid to open up, only to realize that the very thing you feared could bring you peace and healing? Zayne is ready to make the hardest choice of his life. Will he choose love, connection, and vulnerability, or will he retreat into his isolated world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The following days felt like a quiet awakening for Zayne Blackwell. He had made his choice, an intentional step into the unknown, a choice to feel instead of controlling every aspect of his life. The weight of that decision didn't come easily, but with each passing moment, the sense of relief grew. He didn't know how the future would unfold, but for the first time, he was willing to face it without the crutch of control, without the cold armor of isolation.
As the days passed, he spent more time with Kamaria, their connection deepening as they shared stories and moments that he had once buried under the weight of his work. He began to realize that the life he had been running from, the life where he allowed people in, where he embraced the vulnerability of loving and being loved, was the life he had been seeking all along. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the hospice's serene gardens, Zayne sat next to Kamaria on the bench. Miles Blackwell, his grandfather, had passed peacefully 2 nights earlier, and while the pain of loss still lingered, there was a sense of peace in the air. Zayne had spent hours at his grandfather's bedside, remembering the lessons he had learned from them over the years, the wisdom that had shaped him. He had spoken to Miles one last time, telling him everything he hadn't said before, apologizing for the distance, for the years lost. But even as he mourned his grandfather's passing, something had changed within Zayne. The emptiness he had always felt, the ache of loneliness, had begun to fade. He had started to believe in something greater than success, something more profound than wealth. He had started to believe in connection, in real, raw, human love. Kamaria sat beside him, her presence grounding, like an anchor in the storm of emotions that still churned within him. She hadn't pushed him, she had simply been there. And in that simple act of being present, she had helped him heal in ways no one else had. "I've been thinking a lot," Zayne said, his voice quiet as he looked at the horizon. "About my life, about everything I've done. I've spent so long building an empire, but I never stopped to think about what really mattered. I thought that if I could control everything, I wouldn't have to face the pain of losing. But now I realize I was already losing. Losing connection. Losing myself." Kamaria sat beside him, her presence grounding, like an anchor in the storm of emotions that still churned within him. She hadn't pushed him, she had simply been there. And in that simple act of being present, she had helped him heal in ways no one else had. "I've been thinking a lot," Zayne said, his voice quiet as he looked at the horizon, "about my life, about everything I've done. I've spent so long building an empire, but I never stopped to think about what really mattered. I thought that if I could control everything, I wouldn't have to face the pain of losing. But now I realize I was already losing. Losing connection. Losing myself."
"You don't have to face it alone, Zayne," she said softly, her voice filled with tenderness. "And you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you, the real you, the one who's been hiding for so long." He turned to her, his gaze locking with hers. There was something in his eyes now, something raw, something real. It wasn't the billionaire who had controlled everything with his wealth and power. It was the man who was willing to live, to embrace love and vulnerability and everything that came with it. "I'm ready," he whispered, his voice full of resolve. "I'm ready to let go, to be here with you." A warm, genuine smile spread across Kamaria's face. The man she had seen so guarded, so closed off, was finally beginning to open up. And it wasn't just about the connection between them. It was about Zayne finally accepting the truth about himself. "You don't have to rush anything," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "You've made a big step already,
And whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together." As they sat there, the sun slowly sinking behind the horizon, Zayne felt something shift within him. The emptiness that had consumed him for so long had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of hope, of possibility. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like he had to have everything figured out. He just had to be present, present with himself, present with Kamaria, and present with the future that was unfolding before him. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was all that mattered. Have you ever let go of something that you thought defined you, only to realize it was holding you back from what truly mattered? Zayne has come a long way from a man who shut himself off from love to someone willing to embrace vulnerability and connection. Do you think he and Kamaria can build something lasting, or is it too late for him to change? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
You've come to the end of this love story, but another billionaire's secret is waiting. The next tale will be more seductive, more forbidden, and far more addictive. So, do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Until then, guard your heart, because the Powder Room Tales is only getting started.